You're listening to international investment advisor Doug Goldstein on the Goldstein on Gelt show, the financial show where we'll talk about how you can make the most of your money. With all the confusing financial chatter bombarding you each and every day, Goldstein on Gelt will give you the practical information you want and need about living a financially stable life. Here's your host, money maven Doug Goldstein.
Okay, we are back. We are talking to Thomas Woods, who is a New York Times best-selling author. He's written about 11 books. He's been to Harvard and Columbia. He appears all over the news, from CNBC to CNN to the Dennis Prager Show and more. And he's living right now in Topeka, Kansas with his wife and 4 daughters. Tom, it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Pleasure's mine, Doug. Thank you.
Tom, you speak a lot about what's going on in the big picture. And quite frankly, a lot of what I look at is a little bit depressing. And everyone seems to blame someone else, the Democrats, the Republicans in the Middle East here. Israel is blamed for everything. But you talk a lot about big government. Would you say that the government is the cause of all of our problems?
Well, by and large, yes. I mean, I don't mean to say that, of course, private individuals don't cause people headaches and so on and so forth. But my argument throughout much of my work is that if you take some of the worst features of mankind, they become institutionalized in the form of organized coercion that is the state. And what we have done, particularly over the past century, is in effect set up the conditions whereby we are all engaged in a kind of low-intensity civil war with each other, where whatever group you might belong to, whether it's your occupation or your race or your age or the region that you live in or whatever, becomes a sledgehammer with which you try to bash the heads of people who belong to other groups. We all go running to the state trying to get some loot from everybody else to benefit our group, and so every group is grabbing, and we're all grabbing and grabbing and grabbing. But as Frédéric Bastiat, who was the great French 19th century economist, said, the state is the great fiction by which everyone attempts to live at the expense of everyone else. So eventually, the goose stops laying the golden egg, and the result is the kind of worldwide crisis that we're all enduring right now.
So are there any benefits to having government oversee and get involved in our personal life?
Well, in my view, no. It's not a kind of answer I can if I had a few drinks, I could give you a better soundbite answer. But in terms of, I used to be of the opinion that, there are certain indispensable functions that government has to serve, right? I mean, it's got to provide. If we didn't have government, we wouldn't have any arts, we wouldn't have any science, because who would fund it? It doesn't yield short-term profits, so the private sector would shun it and all this. But a lot of these sorts of arguments fall apart when you examine them more closely, and my book Rollback, which came out earlier this year, does that. Like, for example, I wanted to know, how has science actually been funded over the years? And it actually turns out exactly to the contrary of what I had presumed, because it seemed to be common sense. Before there was government science funding, the private sector, as a percentage of GDP, was much more generous than governments have been. And in fact, Japan has the most privatized research and development in the world. England didn't spend a cent on government science in the whole 19th century, and they became the greatest economic and scientific and industrial powerhouse of the whole world. So my point is that a lot of things that we just, without examining it further, we just casually assume because it seems to make sense that, well, good grief, this function must be indispensable or that one must be indispensable. You look more closely and you find out that people acting voluntarily without the gun in the ribs have actually tended to solve these problems surprisingly well over the years.
What about in terms of things that are more to protect people who simply can't protect themselves, whether it's from drugs or being oppressed by some other group where the government needs to step in and protect you?
Well, certainly we have to sympathize with people in situations like this. My inclination is that, for example, in the United States, when it comes to dangerous drugs, sometimes the cure is worse than the disease. And there was a case, I think, that's quite illustrative some years ago in San Diego. All the law enforcement authorities decided that they were going to work together in one giant raid of all the heroin dealers. So they did that. And in one day, they arrested everybody. They got everybody dealing in heroin off the streets. Mm-hmm. So it turns out that for about a week, it was pretty tricky to get heroin in San Diego. But then after that, supply began reappearing, and then within a month, the whole infrastructure was rebuilt. It was just the way it was before, except now the authorities had no idea who was distributing it. So at some level, you have to wonder, maybe when we're trying to protect people from dangerous things or their own bad decisions, it may be counterproductive. It may be better to take the resources we would have spent protecting them and use those resources to, if they should fall into the misuse or abuse of a substance like that, help and treat them instead of just throwing them into a cage. I mean, the United States has more people in prison, not just per capita, but in absolute numbers than any other country in the world. So this has not been a good policy for us. And then in terms of protecting people from oppression, well, sure. I mean, of course, I want people to be protected against crime and so on. But when I compare the private and public sectors at this, there's just no comparison. In the United States right now, if you want to sue somebody, let's say, you feel you've been wronged, well, you better expect to wait 2 or 3 years and spend $40,000. Mm-hmm. But if you go to private arbitration, it'll cost you about $1,000, and it'll be done in a week. Now, the two cases are not entirely comparable, but the point is that, again, it reminds us that there are other ways of other methods of human interaction that have proven much more fruitful, but that we never consider because we, of course, all have this, I think, kind of schoolboy view that the government is there to do all these wonderful things for us, and it's not looking out for itself, it's looking out for our well-being. But my concern is, what if it becomes the oppressor? Instead of protecting me from the oppressor, what's to protect me from it? And this, who is to guard the guardians, as the Romans used to ask?
We are talking to Tom Wood, who is a best-selling author. He appears all over the press talking about some of the major problems with governments. In fact, he wrote a book that's very interesting to me because when I was growing up, I think was when the term politically correct came out. And you've got a book called The Politically Incorrect Guide to American History. People today are talking about being politically correct everywhere, but how is that affecting our lives in general?
Well, political correctness it's not that it's disappeared, even though we don't hear the term as much as we did, say, in the 1980s. But the reason that we don't hear the term so much is because it's become solidified and ossified into our political culture, at least here in the United States. It's so everywhere that you hardly ever talk about it anymore. And the problem with it is that it makes it very hard for people to think outside a very, very narrow box. So when you're talking about U.S. history, which is my field, there's one officially approved way to think about practically all events in U.S. history. Like this was good, this was bad. These were the good presidents, these were the bad presidents. And I think that this is a stultifying and insulting and very dangerous kind of trend for a free society. I mean, I think people should, according to their own values, evaluate the presidents. And as it turns out, in my view, it turns out that all the good presidents are actually the bad presidents. And the presidents that the historians can't even spell their names right turn out to be the great presidents. So what I wanted to do was to try to reinvigorate the conversation about U.S. history by saying that it's not the case that the growth of government has been an unambiguously progressive force in American life, and that the centralization of power in Washington and taking power away from states and localities has not been an unambiguously progressive force, and that when we look through American history through that lens, it leads us to, I think, a very distorted understanding of our history, which leads to pursuing bad policies in the present. If you don't get the history right, as the economist F.A. Hayek said, if you've got history all wrong, you're going to get the present and the future all wrong because you're making judgments based on things that didn't actually occur.
Yeah, I think that's the experience that I find too. And also, I think that when I speak to younger people who are in college now, they don't even have the ability, they're not allowed to say a differing opinion from what the general politically correct tribe believes.
It's terrible. It's all over the universities, and whereas and people say, why is it then that why don't people of different points of view just become professors and try and balance things out? And I don't want to say that all of university life in the U.S. is just hopeless and terrible. It's not. There are still good quality people out there who really do want to teach the truth and not just propaganda, and that's certainly true. But it's incredibly naive to think that it's just a matter of, well, not enough people right of center apply for these jobs or something. These committees are made up of people who I've sat on these committees who oftentimes want to hire somebody like themselves. I have seen cases where people have been hired to teach in history departments, and they've been hired over people who knew several languages, had several scholarly books published with major presses, because they're going to toe the line and the other person isn't. That goes on all the time.
Is that the same with appointing Supreme Court justices in the U.S.?
Yeah, well, there it's even worse, because now it's become just an inevitability that you have to get a mediocrity, because only a mediocrity would have said or written absolutely nothing of substance by the time they're in their 40s and 50s, and that's the only way you can get on is really not have committed yourself to anything.
Well, that's depressing. See, my first question was that I'm feeling depressed, and I don't feel any better.
I'm sorry. I like to be the bearer of good news. I really do. Maybe we're just picking the wrong topics.
Could be.
Who knows?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think we're going to have to save those good topics for hopefully the next time. We've been talking to Tom Woods, best-selling author, a frequent commentator not only on CNBC and CNN and Fox Business and National Public Radio, but also here on the Goldstein on Gelt show. Tom, in the last minute, could you just tell people how could they follow your work?
The easiest way is just to head over to Tom Woods, just my name, tomwoods.com, and there you got my blog, video and audio, and a lot of free stuff.
That sounds great. That always sells well. It's certainly worth everyone's while to go to tomwoods.com. Tom, thanks again.
My pleasure, Doug.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Doug's weekly radio show is heard around the world, but if you miss it, you can download the podcast at www.goldsteinongelt.com. The Goldstein on Gelt show gives you up-to-date financial ideas so you can get on the path to financial freedom. If you'd like your questions answered on the air or off, send Doug an email to doug@profile-financial.com. It's your money for your future, so join Doug every week to build your wealth on the Goldstein on Gelt show.